10-Minute Jazz Lesson Podcast, episode 374. Hey everybody, welcome back to episode 374. Welcome to September, brand new month. So you know what that means. We're going to start a brand new series. And this series is going to be all about the diminished scale. This is one of the most common questions I get is what are the difference between the, different forms of the diminished scale? Where can I use it? What do I play over a diminished chord as opposed to using a diminished sound over a dominant chord? And all kinds of questions that I'm sure you all have sort of floating around your head if you haven't studied this stuff very deeply. So we are going to aim to address all of that stuff. And hopefully after this series, you will go into the world knowing kind of exactly how to command and utilize this really important sound in jazz. But of course, before we dive into the show, just want to remind you can get a PDF of everything from this episode and every episode that we've ever done by joining up to our Patreon program. This is the way we support the show, and you do get a bunch of fantastic jazz education materials in return for a small monthly donation. So if you want to learn more and get signed up, go over to our website, 10minutejazzlesson.com, click on one of the Patreon banners, or go to patreon.com and simply search for the 10-Minute Jazz Lesson Podcast. Quick shout out to some new members of the Patreon family this week. Thank you to our new $5 patrons, Julian, Lindsay, and Ving, and thank you to our new $3 patron, Josh. Welcome to the 10-Minute Jazz Lesson family. All right, let's dive in. So what we are going to start with in this first episode of the series is sort of defining what the diminished scale is. Before we start talking about different forms of it, where we can use it, let's just go to the basics. So the traditional diminished scale, when you hear somebody say, play me a diminished scale, or I'm about to play a diminished scale, it connotates something, in my opinion, throughout my experience. And what that term, the diminished scale, without any other qualifiers, connotates in my mind is an 8-note scale that follows a very specific pattern. And the pattern is whole step followed by a half step. And that pattern just repeats itself until you arrive at the note you started on. So if we started on a concert C and we played that pattern whole half, it would sound like this. Let me play that for you one more time so you really get that sound in your ears. Okay. So the thing about that scale is if we do want to quickly talk about where we're going to use it in a jazz context, is we would use it over a fully diminished 7th chord, or if we see just a plain old diminished triad, that's where we want to use it. So that's the first confusion for a lot of people is, if you know about the other form, which is the half whole, we think to ourselves, all right, well, where do I use whole half? Where do I use half whole? And the answer is that you would use this whole half over basically any type of diminished chord, not half diminished, fully diminished. So fully diminished 7th chord. Or simply if you saw a fully diminished triad. And you could hear it really sounds great, doesn't it? It's very appropriate for that kind of chord, okay? So that is where we're going to use it. And that is what I would define as a diminished scale, okay? Happy to have a discussion about this if you've heard something different. But in my experience, when somebody says, hey, play me the diminished scale without any other kind of qualifier, this is what we're talking about. Whole half. All right? So now that we know that, we know how to form the scale, let's talk about some of the cool parts about this scale. So the thing about a diminished scale is because it's just this repeating pattern of whole steps and half steps, what that means is that actually one scale fits a whole bunch of different keys, if that makes sense. So if you think about that pattern and you think about the notes that are involved, what you actually get is from each one of the whole half diminished scales that you learn, you're actually learning 4 keys of diminished scales by playing the same notes starting on a different root. So think about this for a second in your head. Think about the notes that are in a C diminished scale. And then what you realize is that if you go up to E flat and play the same pattern, whole half, you actually get the same notes just starting on an E flat. And then if you go up to F sharp, you get the exact same collection of notes, just starting and ending on F sharp, and then finally A. So that is really nice. That doesn't actually happen all that often in music where we don't have to learn 12 individual scales. Now, the other part about that is we just talked about how if we start on C, E flat, F sharp, or A, we get the same collection of notes by following that whole half pattern. Now, the other real cool thing is that if you think about C, E flat, F sharp, A stacked on top of each other, that is a diminished 7th chord. And this is great because now it's actually very easy to remember which diminished scales have the same notes. It's all the diminished scales that are involved in the diminished chord, in that diminished 7th chord, right? So if one diminished chord gets us sort of 4 keys of diminished scales, it makes sense that we have 3 sets of those 4 keys, if that makes sense. So this makes actually practicing it very easy, and that's what I want to go into next. How should you practice this stuff to get the basics, to learn all of your basic diminished scales? Well, if you pull out your PDF for this week, the way to do this is to practice them in those 4 scale sets. So the first thing I would do is I would practice concert C, E flat, F sharp, and A diminished, starting from each one of those notes. Then I'm going to go up a half step, practice concert C sharp, E, G, and B flat diminished, because those all have the same notes. And then I'm going to go to my last set. I'm going to practice concert D, F, A flat, and B diminished. So let's hear what that sounds like, and this exercise is on your PDF for this week. And this is exactly how I would practice them. Okay, cool. So there's your first assignment for the week, is to practice those scales in that fashion, and it will really pay off. It'll start to get the sound in your ears, and it'll start getting you playing those diminished scales. Now, we also want to practice the arpeggio. Everything that we practice a scale of, we want to practice the arpeggio. So if you look at page 2 of your PDF, you will see that I have the arpeggios written out, and it's exactly the same way. So I'm going to practice a C diminished arpeggio. And then if I go up to the next note in that arpeggio and play 4 notes, I'm practicing an E flat diminished arpeggio. Then if I go up to the next one, F sharp, and then finally A, That's a great way to practice these because, again, we're practicing multiple things at once. You could think about it like you're practicing all the inversions of a C diminished arpeggio, but at the same time, you're actually practicing 4 keys of a diminished arpeggio. So with diminished in particular, there's interesting ways to practice it where you're like hitting a whole bunch of stuff at once, which again is great that we don't need to go through all 12 keys. We are basically just going through 4 different keys. Okay, so let's hear the arpeggio practice as it's written on your PDF, and this would go through all 12 keys, all 4 sets. All right, so those are the basics. That is the sort of basic information that I think everybody has to know, and the basic things that I think everybody has to practice in order to go any further with this. And believe me, we're going to go a lot further, but you need to take care of this first. So just make sure that you have all of these exercises down and you can play through them and you feel comfortable with it before we go on to anything else. Let me know if you have any questions. Remember, you can grab the PDF by going to our website, 10minutejazzlesson.com, or going to patreon.com and searching for the 10-Minute Jazz Lesson podcast. Get yourself signed up and you get instant access to everything that we've ever done over on that site for one small monthly donation. And that's how we keep this podcast going. So thank you to everybody that is supporting us over there. We really appreciate it, and we couldn't do it without you. All right, we'll see you next week with a brand new episode. Hope everybody's staying safe and healthy out there, and we'll talk to you soon. Have a great weekend.